The night the music stopped. In August 1963, long after the tourists had staggered back to their rooms and the casino floor had softened into a low hum of chips and whispers, the real Las Vegas came alive upstairs at the Sands. The public show was over. The tuxedos were slightly loosened. The ties were crooked. The jokes were sharper. At the center of it all stood Sammy Davis Jr. Electric, unstoppable, pouring life into the room with impressions and rhythm and that grin that could disarm a firing squad. Beside him, leaning against the piano with a glass in hand, was Dean Martin, cool as desert midnight, watching everything without seeming to watch at all. This wasn't just a party, it was a circle of power, studio heads, politicians, high rollers, and yes, a few men whose business cards didn't exist on paper but whose influence was stitched into the fabric of Vegas. Sammy was mid-routine, flipping from Jimmy Stewart to Humphrey Bogart so smoothly the room shook with laughter. Even the toughest faces at the back cracked smiles. For a few minutes, the world outside, with its ugliness and segregation, and doors slammed in faces, disappeared. When he finished, applause erupted. Dean lifted his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he drawled, "the hardest working man in show business." It was affectionate, protective, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I see what you deal with and I stand with you." Then came the voice from the corner table. Loud, slurred, ugly. A mid-level mob associate, a man who believed money bought permission, laughed, and tossed out a racial slur like it was just another punchline. The room did quiet. It died. The piano keys froze under Frank's hands. Ice stopped clinking in glasses. Even the air seemed to pull back. Sammy stood there, smile still faintly on his face, but his eyes had changed. He'd heard that word before, on sidewalks, in hotel lobbies that refused him rooms, from strangers who thought cruelty was a sport. But here, in this room, in Dean's private circle, that hit different. Dean didn't explode. That's what made it terrifying. He simply set his drink down. The glass touched wood with a soft click that echoed louder than the insult had. He walked across the room, slow, deliberate, until he stood in front of the man who suddenly looked far less important than he had 5 seconds earlier. "Stand up," Dean said quietly. The man laughed nervously, tried to wave it off, just joking. Dean's face had gone still, not angry, not loud, just done. When he leaned forward, the microphone on the piano, still live, caught every word. 6 words. "Get out and don't come back." Not shouted, not dramatized, just final. The man tried to protest. Connections, business, influence. Dean didn't blink. "This is my house," he said, louder now so the whole room could hear. "And nobody disrespects my brother in my house." Brother. Not co-star, not colleague, brother. He made the man apologize directly to Sammy, not to save face, but to restore dignity. Only then did he point to the door. The message traveled faster than any rumor ever had. In a city built on power and quiet understandings, Dean Martin had drawn a public line. And in Vegas, lines drawn publicly matter. When the door shut behind the offender, nobody moved. Dean walked back to Sammy and wrapped an arm around him, not for show, not for politics, but because he meant it. "You okay?" Sammy nodded, though his voice betrayed him. Dean didn't pretend it hadn't hurt. "Yeah," he said softly, "I know." Then he turned to the room. "Let's make one thing clear. Anyone who comes for him comes for me." The music started again. Laughter slowly returned, but something fundamental had shifted. Everyone in that room had just witnessed what real loyalty looks like when it costs something. And the story of that night would follow them for decades. Because power isn't measured in fear. It's measured in who you're willing to stand beside when it would be easier not to. The cost of a line in the sand. The next morning, Las Vegas looked exactly the same. Sunlight spilled over the strip. Tourists lined up for buffets. Dealers shuffled cards with practiced calm. But inside the quiet back rooms, the offices where favors were traded and alliances measured, something had shifted. By noon, the story had already reached Chicago. Not through newspapers, not through gossip columns, through the invisible wire that connected men who understood power. A mid-level enforcer had been publicly expelled from the Sands. Not by security, Not by a casino manager. By Dean Martin. And in Vegas in 1963, that wasn't just entertainment drama. That was territory. Upstairs in his suite, Dean sat at a small table with coffee instead of scotch. The previous night replayed in fragments, the silence, the word, Sammy's face. He didn't regret what he'd said, but he understood the weight of it. Vegas was Hollywood. Lines drawn here had consequences. A soft knock came at the door. Frank walked in without waiting to be invited. Frank Sinatra didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You made it interesting last night," Frank said, pouring himself coffee. Dean shrugged. He made it necessary. Frank studied him. "You know that wasn't just some loudmouth at a bar. I know exactly who he was." "And you don't care?" Dean leaned back in his chair. "I care about one thing. Nobody talks to Sammy like that in my house." There it was again. Not political, not performative, personal. Across town, phones were ringing. The man who'd been thrown out, humiliated in front of senators and executives, had already tried to smooth things over. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, said he'd been drinking, said Dean overreacted. But the version that reached higher ears was simpler. He had insulted Sammy Davis Jr. And Dean Martin had responded. In certain circles, that detail mattered. Because Dean wasn't just a performer, he was a draw, a man who filled rooms and tables and hotel towers. The Sands didn't just host him, it depended on him. By late afternoon, one of Chicago's senior figures made a quiet call west. The message was blunt: "Is this a problem?" The answer from Vegas was calmer, colder. "No, it's handled." The insult had created a choice. Back the rising enforcer, or back the man who made the money flow. In Vegas, economics wins. That evening, Sammy knocked on Dean's door. He wasn't in a tux this time. No spotlight, no microphone, just a man carrying something heavy. "You didn't have to do that," Sammy said quietly. Dean looked up from the television. "Yeah, I did." Sammy hesitated. "You could have pulled him aside, kept it quiet." Dean stood and crossed the room. "If I kept it quiet, it would have meant I was embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed of you." That landed. For years, Sammy had navigated rooms where he was celebrated on stage and sidelined off it. He had been denied hotel rooms in cities where his name lit marquees, applauded under chandeliers, then refused entry at front desks. He was used to swallowing it. But that night, Dean hadn't swallowed anything. "You could lose work over this," Sammy said. Dean smirked faintly. "Then I'll sing somewhere else." There was no bravado in it, just fact. Outside, rumors kept spreading. Casino managers quietly removed the banned man's access. Hotel bookings were canceled without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving. Nobody announced it publicly. But in a city built on access, the door had closed. Back in Chicago, the man who'd thrown the slur found himself reassigned not upward but sideways. Milwaukee, smaller operations, less visibility, less prestige. He never set foot in Vegas again. Not because of violence. Because of silence. Because one performer had said 6 words and meant them. A week later, the Rat Pack was back on stage at the Sands. The audience had no idea what had unfolded upstairs days earlier. They saw tuxedos, heard punchlines, felt music. But something new lived between the men on that stage. During a break in the show, Dean stepped to the microphone and glanced sideways at Sammy. "Let's hear it for my brother," he said casually. The applause was thunderous. Sammy bowed slightly, eyes shining under the lights. The world outside hadn't changed overnight. Racism didn't evaporate because of one confrontation. America in 1963 was still raw, still divided. But inside that room, one truth had been made permanent. Loyalty wasn't negotiable. Later that night, alone on the balcony overlooking the Strip, Dean lit a cigarette and watched the neon flicker below. Frank joined him. "You think it was worth it?" Frank asked. Dean exhaled smoke into the desert air. "Some things cost you," he said. "Some things cost you more if you don't do them." Frank nodded. They didn't need to say more. Because sometimes the aftermath of courage isn't fireworks. It's quiet shifts. Doors that close softly. reputations that change shape, and friendships that grow stronger because someone chose not to stay comfortable. In the months that followed, executives who had witnessed that night treated Sammy differently. A little more respect, a little less casual dismissal. They had seen what standing beside him looked like, and they had seen the consequences of crossing that line. The Sands kept thriving, the shows kept selling out, the music never stopped. But everyone who had been in that private lounge understood something deeper now. Dean Martin's charm wasn't weakness. It was control. When the spotlight fades, the weeks after that night didn't explode into headlines. They simmered. On stage, everything looked effortless. The tuxedos were pressed. The jokes landed. The glasses sparkled under the chandeliers. To the public, the Rat Pack was untouchable, swagger wrapped in velvet. But backstage, there was a quiet awareness now. People watched their words. They understood that something sacred had been defined. One evening, just before curtain, Sammy Davis Jr. sat alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection. The makeup lights framed his face in a warm halo, but his expression was distant. He had been in show business since he was a child. He had survived vaudeville circuits, brutal road tour, segregated hotels. He had learned how to smile through insult because sometimes survival required it. But that night in the private lounge kept replaying. Not the slur. The response. He'd spent years being tolerated. That night he had been defended. There's a difference. A soft knock. Dean Martin stepped in without ceremony, adjusting his cufflinks. "You're thinking too hard," Dean said. Sammy gave a faint smile. "Since when did you become a mind reader?" "Since you started staring at mirrors like they owe you money." Sammy chuckled, but his voice turned serious. "You know what the weirdest part was?" Dean leaned against the doorframe. "I've heard worse," Sammy said. "Out there on the street from strangers, but when he said it in that room, I felt 12 years old again." Dean didn't interrupt. Sammy continued, "Like I didn't belong, like it was all temporary." Dean crossed the room slowly. "You do belong, and it's not temporary." It wasn't a grand speech, just steady certainty. And that steadiness mattered. Out on the strip, the story had evolved into something almost mythical. People didn't repeat the ugly word, they didn't need to. They repeated Dean's 6 words instead. "Get out, don't come back." It became shorthand. A warning. A code. Meanwhile, the man who had been expelled found his world shrinking. Business deals cooled. Invitations dried up. His transfer to Milwaukee felt less like strategy and more like exile. Nobody wanted to cross someone who could shift the temperature of a room the way Dean could. Because this wasn't just about entertainment, it was about influence. Back at the Sands, opening night of a new run drew a packed house. Senators, celebrities, foreign dignitaries, the air buzzed with anticipation. Midway through the set, Dean motioned for quiet. He turned toward Sammy. "You know," Dean said casually into the mic, "people think we just stand up here and fool around." Laughter. "But the truth is," he continued, glancing sideways, "this man right here works harder than all of us combined." The audience applauded. Sammy tilted his head modestly. Dean added, "And if anybody's got a problem with him, they've got a problem with me." It sounded like a joke. But it was. From the wings, executives exchanged glances. They understood subtext. They understood alignment. Sammy launched into a dance number so sharp, so alive, that the crowd leapt to its feet before he finished. The spotlight didn't just illuminate him. It honored him. Later that night, after the crowd had gone and the neon outside flickered against the desert sky, the group gathered again in the private lounge. This time, the laughter felt different. Stronger, less fragile. Frank raised his glass. Frank Sinatra wasn't sentimental by habit, but even he knew when something mattered. "To brothers," he said simply. Glasses clinked. Sammy looked at Dean across the table. "You know they'll test you again," Sammy said quietly. Dean shrugged. "Let them." "You're not afraid." Dean took a slow sip. "Of what? Doing the right thing." It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. Outside those walls, 1963 America was boiling. Civil rights marches filled streets. Tensions rose in cities across the country. Change felt both urgent and dangerous. In that context, what had happened in a private Vegas lounge might have seemed small. But small moments define culture. And culture shapes history. Months passed. The Rat Pack toured, the Sands thrived, the story became legend. And yet, the real impact wasn't in the myth. It was in the private shifts. Studio heads who once hedged their bets started signing contracts more confidently with Sammy at the top of billing. Casino managers reconsidered unwritten rules. Performers took note of what solidarity looked like when it carried risk. Not loud, not performative, just firm. One quiet night after a show, Sammy found Dean on the balcony again, looking out over the glowing strip. "You ever regret it?" Sammy asked. Dean didn't turn around. No. Not even a little. Dean exhaled smoke into the warm air. "I regret not doing it sooner." Sammy smiled at that. The desert wind moved gently around them, carrying distant music and the hum of the city. Vegas would keep spinning. The shows would keep selling. But something permanent had settled between them. Not obligation. Not image. Trust. And trust, once proven under pressure, becomes unbreakable. Years later, people would remember the glamour, the jokes, the martinis. But the men who had been in that room would remember something else. They would remember that the spotlight doesn't just reveal talent. Sometimes, years later when it meant even more, time has a way of sanding down legends. The tuxedos get folded away, the neon changes color, the laughter echoes softer than it once did. By the late 1980s, the Rat Pack wasn't a nightly headline anymore. It was history. A golden era sealed in vinyl records and grainy television clips. But history has a pulse, and sometimes it comes back to sit beside you. In 1988, Sammy Davis Jr. received the diagnosis that no performer ever wants to hear: throat cancer, aggressive, unforgiving. The voice that had filled showrooms, cracked punchlines, carried ballads into the rafters, now fragile. When the news reached Dean Martin, he didn't make a public statement. He didn't call a press conference. He got on a plane. Hospitals don't care about legends. The fluorescent lights hum the same for everyone. Machines blink without emotion. Dean walked into Sammy's room slower than he used to move. Age had caught up with both of them. But the presence was the same. Sammy looked smaller in the bed, thinner, but his eyes lit up. "Well, look who finally decided to visit," Sammy rasped softly. Dean pulled up a chair. "I was busy," he said. "Had to finish a drink." Sammy smiled. Even sick, he knew the rhythm. They sat in silence for a while, not awkward, just real. Outside the window, the world moved forward. New stars, new music, new headlines. Inside that room, time folded back on itself. "You remember the Sands?" Sammy asked quietly. Dean didn't hesitate. "Every night." Sammy's voice grew more serious. "You remember that night upstairs?" It wasn't a question. Dean nodded once. Sammy stared at the ceiling for a moment. "I've had people clap for me, awards, standing ovations, presidents shaking my hand." He turned his head slowly toward Dean. "But that was the night I felt safe." The words hung there. Safe. Not celebrated. Not admired. Safe. Dean swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have needed me for that," he said. "Maybe not," Sammy replied, "but you were there." For decades, Sammy had navigated rooms where applause didn't always equal acceptance, where contracts came with quiet conditions, where respect was sometimes borrowed, never fully given. But that night in 1963 had drawn a line. Not in public speeches. Not in headlines. In action. Dean leaned forward slightly. "You were never alone, you know that." Sammy gave a faint laugh. "I know that now." Outside the hospital, reporters speculated. Fans sent letters. Old footage replayed on television, tuxedos, martinis, perfectly timed punchlines. They saw charm. They didn't see the private loyalty that had built it. Dean stayed longer than anyone expected, longer than his schedule allowed, longer than his own declining health comfortably permitted. Because when you call someone your brother, that doesn't expire. Weeks later, when Sammy performed one of his final shows, his voice thinner but his spirit intact, the audience rose before he finished the first verse. In the wings, Dean watched quietly. No spotlight on him. No microphone. Just presence. After the show, Sammy gripped Dean's hand backstage. "You know what people remember?" Sammy asked. "The jokes," Dean replied. "No," Sammy said. "They remember who stood where." Dean didn't answer. He didn't need to. When Sammy passed in 1990, the tributes flooded in. Presidents, entertainers, civil rights leaders. Headlines called him groundbreaking, fearless, brilliant. All true. But Dean, sitting alone at home after the funeral, didn't think about the awards. He thought about a private lounge. A silence. 6 words. And the look in his friend's eyes when he realized he wasn't standing alone. 5 years later, in 1995, Dean would follow him. 2 legends. 2 complicated men. But beneath the myth and the martinis was something simpler. A choice made in a moment when it would have been easier not to choose. People like to say courage is loud. Sometimes it is. But sometimes courage is quiet. It's setting down a glass. It's walking across a room. It's saying calmly without theatrics, "That line doesn't get crossed here." And decades later, in a hospital room filled with machines and memory, that choice still echoed. Because fame fades. Neon burns out. Voices weaken. But the memory of someone standing up for you when it mattered most, that stays.